So we're again looking at actus reus, and we're looking at that same criminal statute that the court was looking at in Gastello. When someone is arrested and then brought into a jail, the officer tells them, if you bring drugs into the jail, then you're going to be guilty of a felony. And they either say, I have no drugs on me, or they simply say nothing and are brought into the jail. Have they knowingly brought drugs into a jail? Have they committed the voluntary act of bringing the drugs into the jail? And much like last time, let's pull up our statute, because it is the same statute in People versus Low as we were looking at in People versus Gastello. Gastello was the California Court of Appeal opinion, and that is California Court of Appeal, not Court of Appeals. There's no S on the California one. Don't ask me why. It's the only state in the country to do that. But just know that so you can be very precise when you're referring to an opinion from that particular court. But if we go back to this statute, now the California Court of Appeal in People versus Low is re-examining the question that the California Supreme Court is re-examining the question that the California Court of Appeal looked at in People versus Gastello. And so as we have highlighted on this screen, the word brings, this entire case is about that one word, brings. Does that word, it certainly requires a voluntary act. The court, the California Supreme Court certainly agrees with the California Court of Appeals, California Court of Appeal, that the word brings in this statute requires a voluntary act. The disagreement between the lower court and the state Supreme Court is what exactly it means for there to be a voluntary act of bringing the drugs in. And for the Supreme Court, the fact that the defendant, in this case Low, was given an opportunity to disgorge the drugs. The defendant was told, if you bring drugs into a prison or a jail, you're going to be guilty of a felony. At that moment, the California Supreme Court says that Low was presented with the opportunity, with the choice. Do I want to go into the jail with these drugs and thereby subject myself to a felony prosecution, or do I want to disgorge the drugs? And the fact that he had a moment at which he could choose to say, wait a minute, I should tell you I have these drugs on me. Here they are, knowing that he would be charged for possession, but not also for the possession within a jail. That moment in time where he had an opportunity to confess to the crime of possession and take his lumps for that, as opposed to going into the jail with the drugs, that moment in time, that course he took, that decision not to disgorge the drugs, was in fact a moment at which, according to the California Supreme Court, he voluntarily chose to go forward into the jail and therefore with the drugs, and therefore, not that he voluntarily went into the jail, but he chose to voluntarily go into the jail with the drugs on him, not to disgorge the drugs, and therefore he voluntarily brought the drugs into the jail with him. Now, the California Supreme Court also addresses a couple of other things that are worth talking about. They look at this Alabama case from the 40s that the lower court had also looked at. It was State versus Martin. And in State versus Martin, police officers came and got a guy from his house who happened to be drunk. They pulled him into the street. And once he was in the street because they pulled him there, they arrested him for being drunk in public. And he said, and the Alabama Court of Appeals agreed with him, that drunkenness in public presupposed that your presence in public was voluntary, which it was not if he was brought there by the police officers. And in this case, the court says, this case is not the same. If the crime in this case were being in a jail, then he was not voluntarily in a jail. But that's not the crime. The crime is voluntarily bringing something into the jail with you. Going into the jail, if you're there visiting someone, or if you're there because you're being arrested, It doesn't matter. The only question, according to the California Supreme Court, is whether in going into the jail, you are voluntarily bringing drugs with you. And because he had that moment in time where he could have disgorged the drugs, said, oh, don't send me in there with these drugs. I have them. I can't take them in there with me. And I know I'm going to be prosecuted for felony possession of whatever I have. It may only be a misdemeanor, but I'm going to be prosecuted for the possession of what I have. The fact that he had that opportunity, according to the California Supreme Court, means that he had a choice and chose to go forward into the jail with the drugs he voluntarily brought them in. We're going to talk in our next set of slides, our next set of videos, about mens rea. This is a case about actus reus, but I want to flag for you the fact that there is a mens rea in this statute. I want you to look at it because the mens rea to this statute actually shows how the mens rea and actus reus often can get confused, and one can help explain the other. So take a look at our statute again. Anyone who knowingly brings is the word we've been talking about this whole case, in both these cases, that there's a voluntariness requirement upon that. But look at the mens rea. The mens rea is knowingly. And knowingly, as the California Supreme Court says in Low, simply means that you are aware of the fact that you're doing something. So knowingly brings, if we look at this sort of holistically and look at the mens rea term as informing the actus reus terms, look at what the defendant was arguing. And it was a very smart argument from a policy standpoint. He said, why would the California legislature, in its wisdom, come up with a statute like this? They would do so because they didn't want people to inject drugs into a prison, to smuggle drugs into a prison to sell them. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, why punish someone over and above the crime of possession because they're hauled into jail with drugs on them? Why would you punish them for not confessing to the crime of possession? Because that really is what we're talking about. You don't disgorge the drugs when you enter the jail, and therefore you're guilty of not only the possession of the drugs, but bringing them in. It makes a lot of sense to interpret this statute as one that is criminalizing the smuggling in of drugs to sell them. And that would mean that you're intentionally trying to get the drugs into the prison. And that would also mean that we interpret bringing to require something more than the drugs being on you as you're involuntarily brought into the prison. But look at this kind of holistically. If we were to interpret the statute that way, if we were to say what the legislature's true intent here was to prevent smuggling of drugs so that drugs could be sold or given to your friends in jail, there's a real easy way to write the mens rea term to achieve that goal. Anyone who intentionally brings drugs into a prison knowingly seems to capture more. Knowingly seems to reflect exactly what the California Supreme Court in Low is saying, that you are aware that drugs are on you when you come into the jail. If we were just trying to capture smuggling for the intent of distribution, intentionally bringing would have been a better way to describe that. So when we're looking at actus reus, it's not wholly irrelevant to ask, what kind of mens rea are you requiring at the same time? Take away from this video and these cases that actus reus, in this case, brings, has an independent voluntariness requirement. In understanding what that voluntariness requirement is, whether failing to disgorge the drugs would be enough for that voluntary act, it's not irrelevant to look at the statute holistically. What do we mean when we say knowingly brings? Does that give the word bring a different flavor than it would if we had said intentionally bring? And absolutely the answer is yes. So we attempt to divine what the legislature meant by looking at least at the entirety of the words of the statute. And we'll see examples in this class where the court will look at things even beyond the words of the statute. But we're trying at all times to figure out what the legislature meant by these words it gave us in these statutes.